All right, looks good. Hi, everybody. My name is Laird Christensen, and I direct the Masters of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities program here at Prescott College. And we've been hosting these community resilience conversations really since the isolation started, trying to find different topics to talk about, hearing from alums, hearing from colleagues, last week hearing from just folks who find themselves dealing with the emotional and personal impact of isolation. So that was great to have that perspective too. But throughout the time that I've been shifting my own thinking about my work from focusing almost entirely on how does society evolve to meet the climate crisis, shifting from that to what do we have to do to support our communities and to create strong communities in the time of pandemic, has led me to think about how do these two pieces of our work really fit together. To what extent should we be talking about societal transformation, the impacts of climate change at a time when people are really thinking about the pandemic and finding their lives changed by their attempt to stay isolated. And so what is a useful integration of those concerns? Is it time, now that we hear more and more people talking about getting back to normal, to actually start the conversation about what that means to get back to normal? And just as a way of setting this conversation up, and just before I introduce the people that I've invited to join us today, I do want to pass along a perspective that was shared through the Climate Access page, and I included a link to this in the chats, that suggested that we can most effectively communicate about climate change by being sensitive to what people are going through. And that if we, for example, celebrate the drop in carbon emissions due to the isolation and the disruption of the economy, and we do so without being compassionate, thinking about all the people out there who have lost their jobs or are feeling some degree of uncertainty about that, it's not probably going to be a very effective message that we're delivering. So in that link that I've shared, the author of that piece does make the case that during the actual crisis, where people are dealing with some level of disempowerment or even trauma, building those mutual support networks, having relationships with people that shows that we're there to be a part of the community and help the community is probably the best thing that we can be doing. But that people are unusually susceptible or open to changes in lifestyles after dealing with a huge trauma like this, and that there will be a quote unquote window of engagement that opens up when we move out of the worst of the current situation and try to reclaim our sense of normalcy. So the topic of today's conversation is back to normal or moving on. And let me just briefly introduce to you some of the people that I've asked to be here with us today. And I'll just go based on how I'm seeing them up here on the screen. The first is Steve Letendre. Steve is an energy economist who's been working for more than 20 years now on transforming the electric grid to accommodate solar and other intermittent resources, focusing on energy literacy education, electric vehicles, and he's currently a consultant in energy and economics. He's working on a project in Maine about greenhouse gas mitigation right now. So I wanted to have somebody representing the energy perspective here, and thank you so much for being able to join us, Steve. We've also got up in my right-hand corner, we probably all have different grids, it just occurs to me now, Amanda Sesser, who is a climate scientist from the University of Alaska, is where her degree is from, but she's living down in New Orleans now. And I've gotten to know Amanda over the last couple of years as she's been teaching courses for me in the graduate program. She teaches Understanding Climate Change. And it was actually a conversation that I had with Amanda as we were discussing course development and that sort of thing that really led me to think this is a conversation that people would be interested in right now. And one of the things that Amanda suggested during that conversation was it would be really nice to have an energy perspective in that conversation. And so immediately I thought of Steve. So we've got these this weave of different people coming together with different perspectives. And this is also an opportunity for those of you who are tuning in to share your own perspectives. I thought it would be useful to ask Jenn Weaver to join us. Jenn is somebody who I've just gotten to know virtually through these community resilience conversations. Jenn is a Prescott College alum who's the mayor of Hillsborough, North Carolina. And I got to thinking about the work of municipal administration and when everything is on hold and you're just trying to help keep people calm and working as much as possible, that that aspiration of getting back to normal, it seems to me, probably plays out much more heavily in the work that Jenn does than in the work that somebody who's helping shape energy systems of the future, for example. You know, that opportunity to deviate from what normal means would be really exciting to some. But I thought it would be really useful to have Jenn's perspective here, so I'm delighted to have her. And then I also asked Kenneth Mulder to join us, and Kenneth's little label there says Ezekiel Mulder. Zeke's his son, but this is Kenneth. And Kenneth is somebody that I worked with back in Vermont who is an ecological economist, I believe from University of Michigan. Is that right, or is it Michigan State?
University of Vermont, the Gund Institute up there.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. And I asked Kenneth on for a few reasons, not only because I thought it would be great to have an economist's perspective on this, and we can get some of that from Steve as well, but because of the choices that Kenneth has made over the years that I've known him in how he and his family think about ways to reduce their impact on resources, on the earth, if you want to speak about it in those larger terms. When I think about Kenneth Mulder's style of economics, I think about somebody who figures out, what does this look like in my own life? What changes can I take to begin to reflect those deeper sort of academic understandings of economics. So here we have a great opportunity to reflect on how is the economy potentially going to be impacted by this disruption, but also how do my personal actions reflect that? And I don't mean to suggest by contrast that other people haven't also been making those kinds of decisions. Steve, for example, has a beautiful net zero energy straw bale house up in the hills that is just really, I think, a model of a beautiful way of living as simply as possible. Anyhow, that's perhaps enough of a lead in. So what I'm going to do to just start this conversation off is ask you, when you talk with people who are excited about getting back to normal, and Jenn, actually, maybe I'll go ahead and just sort of lob this to you first. To what extent are you embracing that vision of getting back to normal? And do you find yourself in situations where you try to, I guess, moderate the expectations of people that you're talking with?
I typically have been trying to moderate it. I will preface that by saying that, you know, government is an inherently conservative with a little c entity. You know, things happen slowly, frustratingly slow. You know, you all know all this, but so it's always going to be a challenge to be looking for powerful change from your municipal government. You know, that is sometimes people's expectations are not in sync with that ability. And I will just say that the context matters. So in North Carolina, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but we are what's called a Dillon rule state, so that our local governments are only allowed to do what we are explicitly told we can do by the state. So our ways of raising revenue are extremely limited. It's basically the sales tax and property tax, and that's it. So that's the context in which I'm governing. And that said, you know, since I was on the town council for 7 years before I ran for mayor, and the whole time of that path, I've been talking about, you know, needing to view our local government through environmental sustainability and racial equity framework. And, you know, as I've said on a couple other of these calls, have been, you know, shown some leadership over time, though everyone is very much on board, including the staff, if this isn't only me, with, you know, needing to have a climate action plan for our town. So this is not new language for me to be speaking to my community. And at the same time, that's where I'm coming from. And we are a pretty progressive town, but not 100%, you know. So that's in the context of there are people in the community who, you know, are like, reopen, you know, do all this, let's go back to normal. And the pull to use the word normal is very powerful in myself. And it's something I have to, you know, that language and communication piece, I'm really excited to read this article, is so important, because I don't want things to go back to normal. And so that's something that I talk about in these weekly updates that I do about, you know, normal doesn't work so great for a lot of people. In fact, for any of us, when you really look at it. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Let me invite any of our other panelists to jump in on that question. When you talk to people about getting back to normal, what does that look like in the conversations that you're having?
I'll jump in. Maybe I won't, I'll take a little bit of a different tact. So, you know, what Jen was referencing, you know, we haven't had, I'm saying kind of before the crisis, you know, we haven't had a lot of leadership nationally on energy sustainability. And, you know, in my work as a consultant, we support a variety of state, local agencies that are trying to navigate this transition in light of the climate crisis that we face. So there is really broad appreciation of what has to happen to transform our energy sector. You know, we've did a project for the city of Burlington. The city wanted to understand what's it going to take to become a net zero energy city by the 2030. And then we're now working with the city of Boston to come up with net zero energy building codes for large commercial and industrial buildings. In many parts of the country, they are stopping any new natural gas hookups to buildings and infrastructure. So although we're not seeing much leadership on the federal level, there has been a tremendous push at the state, local, and municipal level to address the climate crisis. So then the COVID comes and in kind of a social and economic crisis, you know, and every day we're getting new data about energy use. Everyone has heard the price of oil was negative, and that's because people were driving so much less because we're working from home. For those of us that are fortunate to have continued employment. I was looking at data, the Mass Pike, the traffic is about a quarter of what it is typically. And the utility system, the demand for electricity is down universally 3 to 5%. In the load shape, utilities are turning on and off power plants based on how we use electrical energy, and that whole load shape has changed, the way that we're using energy. is changing. So this crisis has really, on the one hand, has really shown us what's possible in terms of our habits and the way we use energy. Is it desirable? Perhaps not, but maybe it could lead to some longer term behavioral changes, more telecommuting, now that this has become kind of an effective, accepted way of collaborating with folks. That may be one of the knock-on benefits of this crisis. And I'll just conclude by saying, but that cuts the other way too. I know that those folks that deliver energy efficiency services in communities are not able to do their work. They can't go into homes and weatherize. They're not able to go and install heat pumps or electric vehicle charging stations. The solar industry has really collapsed as a result. So at the same time, we're at this really exciting arc for those technologies and these solutions. This really has created a barrier to that continued progress. So kind of less so kind of on the conversations, but kind of what I'm observing kind of in the energy and how society has been transforming based on the many different dynamics of this crisis.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to come back and talk in more detail about some of those aspects. Amanda, it seems to me, as I recall, that in the conversation that we were having a couple of weeks ago, you had mentioned, I think, that your partner having a different take on getting back to normal than you did, and to have that conversation within a household is very different, of course, than having it on the street or in the public arena or that sort of thing. I wonder if you can give us a sense from your own perspective as a climate scientist, and maybe reflect just briefly on the kind of work and consulting that you've been doing about how you would have a conversation about getting back to normal.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up. I've forgotten about that, but I think that's what spurred this whole conversation was me bringing up that my partner Jason had read an article. It was a survey that was administered in the United Kingdom that said only 9% of the public wanted to go back to normal. And his just gut reaction, just reading the headline, was that he thought people wanted to stay in lockdown mode and keep teleworking and wearing sweatpants all day and not brushing your teeth. And when he told me that, I went, yes, this is amazing that people are thinking of this as a potential opportunity. And then of course that opened up the discussion, and we realized that that's what people were talking about in the survey, and just the overwhelming numbers, 9%. So that meant over 90% of people in the UK think that it's time for a change. And I got this quote. It came across my phone feed this morning, but it's from the popular writer and speaker Brene Brown. She said, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." So I thought I would just bring that up because I think it summarizes, at least for me, the way that I'm looking at this. As Jenn mentioned, that normal hasn't really been working, and she said for anybody. I think if we really look at ourselves in the mirror and be very introspective, even those of us that are quote unquote successful in our careers or in our family lives, we realize that the way that we're living and consuming, and we're always busy and never have time for our families, or never have time to stop and notice nature, or a lot of the other patterns that we've gotten into just in our normal society that just aren't healthy. And then of course there's the racial inequality and income inequality, and a lot of the oppression that's been happening for hundreds of years in our country that makes the normal not work at all for a very large portion of our population. But to take a step back and talk a little bit about what I do, I think that Steve and I would be the perfect pair, because where he works on mitigation, I work mostly with adaptation. And so I trust that folks like Steve are out there doing a great job to try to mitigate and lower the carbon emissions and increase sequestration. And I work mostly with these days, I work mostly with policymakers and decision makers about what to do with changes in climate. And there's an overwhelming sense, not just in the US, but around the world of, we know that climate change is happening. We know it's a crisis. Even in the US federal government, it's widely understood that this is a crisis and we need to do something. But our natural resource practitioners and decision makers, our policymakers say, but we don't know where to even start. And so that's a kind of a niche that I've carved for myself, is looking at adaptation strategies that encompass both social and ecological outcomes, and looking at large scale planning, but also a lot of scientific translation to policymakers in that arena as well. Like, what does this really mean? And you don't have to have a PhD to read 20 papers a week to be able to understand some of the general trends. So I use a lot of scenario planning and tools to help people that are paralyzed with all the uncertainty. I don't know what to do, or what if I make the wrong decision? So structured decision making and other tools to help people get out of the analysis paralysis and start to do adaptive management, adaptive decision making. And I think a lot of those tools would be very useful when thinking about how to construct a new normal or a new way of life, because we don't know what the possibilities are. So we can start to envision that and say, well, what if? What if we did this? What if we did that? What would be the pros and the cons?
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I can, with what each of you says, I can imagine many ways of looping back into these conversations, very quickly and really opening them up too. And maybe that, how do we redefine normal, is one of the places that we'll want to jump in and think about the fact that normal, even though it might not be what many of us aspire to in our best visions of ourselves, I want a really normal life, is comforting. It's what we take for granted. And to be in a situation where people are pushed out of that level of comfort and say, hey, let's sustain this state of being off balance, is probably not attractive. So how do we redefine a new normal in a way that people can actually get behind? But as I said, I think we'll curve back around to these conversations. I do want to hear from Kenneth first. And Kenneth, just thinking about that larger conversation, if you were to talk with folks at work or your family or other people about getting back to normal, I wonder what you would have to say about that.
Sure. I first want to just, Amanda said, talking to people about climate change, people don't know where to start. And what we've seen with the pandemic is we totally know how to address a crisis. We can figure out where to start. It's just a matter of time scale. If people could envision the destruction that climate change is going to cause happening over the next year, we would know where to start. We would say, okay, if you're not an essential worker, you stay home, you don't drive. If you need to get somewhere, we're going to help you find low carbon ways to do it. We're very clearly, one of the bright spots of this whole crisis is humankind when they see an existential threat and say, wow, I could die if I go shopping when I don't need to. I can stay home. We have the ability to do that, but unfortunately, the impacts of climate change, which will be much larger, are still decades away. And the ones that are happening now, we have lots of ways of kind of arguing around them, and are they really climate change and so on. I guess when it comes back to returning to normal or what that means, I don't think in the long run, I don't see us changing significantly from this. And by the long run, economists are always talking short run versus long run. I'm thinking within a decade, because I don't see any significant structural changes being planned in our economy. As we look ahead, we're still envisioning a relatively free market economy. I don't see the United States really adapting a large role for the federal government. That might happen in some other countries, but those are probably other countries that already are doing that. And without that, we're going to really struggle. And the reason we're going to really struggle is we have an economy that requires consumption. If the federal government isn't going to play a role in managing the economy, then a reduction in consumption leads to very unequal impacts. And so, ecological economists for decades now, going back to the 70s, have wanted a steady state economy, essentially zero growth in the physical economy. And then we've always said, well, it doesn't mean the economy can't grow in other ways. But we've never been able to lay out a map that gets us there without significant economic disruption. Because you reduce consumption, then you have to reduce production. Reduce production, you reduce people working. And that's part of what we're seeing right now. So there are certainly sectors of the economy saying, boy, this is kind of nice. I'm staying home. I haven't driven in a long time. But at the same time, we have lines out the blocks long for food banks and for help. And we've done stopgap measures of payroll protection so we can get people through a few weeks or a month. But that's not structural change. That's saying, can we, kind of tread water until we get past this? And then when we get past it, we have to dive back into making the economy work, i.e. steady growth. And that growth might be lower carbon, thanks to the efforts of people like Steve, but it's still growth. And so, when I think about what could new normal look like that might be exciting, the most exciting thing I've thought of is when the government says we're thinking of hiring 100,000 corona testers. That's what we need. Take those 100,000 folks. They test for corona right now. When the pandemic starts easing up, you don't lay them off. You transition them to being tutors in your local school, to being trail managers and wildlife restorers and ecological restorers. The federal government's got to take the lead role to say, if we're going to avoid climate change, we need to transition to a green economy, and that doesn't happen through private demand. It doesn't happen through consumption. So, all right, there's some ideas.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. And you made a point early on that I think is reinforcing. And forgive me for referring so often to this single article, but it really is defining the way I'm thinking about this right now. The author is Robin Webster, who's the Senior Climate Change Engagement Strategist at Climate Outreach. And again, this article is linked to in the chat, Communicating Climate Change During the Coronavirus. But one of the points that she made in this article is that behaviors change when social norms shift. People understand the reasons to ask. These reasons resonate with their concerns. And then, most importantly, they have the capacity to make such change. And you sort of raised that point in your comments, Kenneth, that we are seeing now that we do have the capacity to make large-scale changes in our lives when we understand the threat to be large and significant enough. And in that window of engagement that follows what we're going through now, if we want to help people, prepare people to understand themselves as agents of social change, we will have an example to say, look, what we are capable of doing when the threat is perceived as serious enough. One of the problems is that climate change, the impacts of climate change are sort of a slow motion threat, unlike COVID crisis, and we may not feel the same sense of urgency. I want to pause for a moment to just allow any of you to respond to what other folks have said or jump in here. I've got plenty of questions and I can lead things along as they need to be, but I'm really especially interested to hear from you all. So if you've heard something from someone else that you'd like to respond to, let's take that opportunity to now.
I mean, maybe if I could just jump in and kind of riffing off a little bit, what I've heard is really, you know, we're a consumer society and we've been thrust into a situation which has altered many of our consumption patterns. And I've actually heard from folks, I was actually having a conversation with a former colleague from Green Mountain, Lucas Brown, and he was saying, you know, I'm actually having dinner every night with my family. Like, I'm not working 14 hours. Like, people, you know, so this may be an opportunity to say, you know, if I trade off consumption for, you know, lifestyle and time with family and nature, I mean, I don't know if that would be, you know, a lasting kind of social norm that emerges. But there is, I think, some people are kind of in this crisis, kind of reevaluating, I think, their values and maybe, you know, would come out the other side with some different priorities.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in too. Thank you, everyone. This is just terrific. All these conversations have been great. This is in somewhat response to comments all of you made, but I'm thinking a little bit about how Rebecca Solnit writes about how when there are big catastrophes that we think people are chaotic and, you know, we're going to, you know, rob each other. Actually, that's not what happens. People really try to take care of each other and step in new ways. And I do think that is one of I do not want to give the misinterpretation that this incredibly dangerous and damaging event is a good thing, but it is showing us the beauty of how people do come together in community. And I picked up a great phrase from another colleague of mine, which is physical distance, social solidarity, and really trying not to even use that word social distancing, but using physical distancing instead. And in thinking about, we have a food council. Like, what is that thing called? We have a county food council, and it's built from a racial justice lens. The council has done a ton of education in the community, trying to get people to think about their work as really being about justice and not about charity, because in an ideal world, we don't have food scarcity, and, you know, trying to really create that. And it's been so hard to get people to understand that. And then just all the walls that are up to really creating a sustainable food system that's local-ish. We are in, I think, the only county in North Carolina where the number of farms is growing, small farms, but most of that food is shipped out of the county because of the way, you know, those supply chains work. But, you know, boom, coronavirus happens, and these supply chains for all these folks who are trying to feed people. So we have, of course, a much greater need. The food scarcity has increased tremendously, especially when you think of the role that the schools typically play in that. So with that disruption, suddenly we have local farmers it's opening up windows to have more of that food staying here, getting to people in this community. And I find that really exciting, and hope that you know, is something that carries through in whatever it is we build next. So I'm excited about that. I also just want to echo what Kenneth said. So local change is awesome. And I do think we're going to keep hearing more and more about some local solutions that are coming out of this event. But it can't be underestimated how that structural change has to come from the federal level. Like that is the only entity with really enough power and capacity to make that happen. And, you know, I don't have to convince y'all that it's hard.
So the issue has come up now a couple of times through Kenneth and Jenn around equity or justice and privilege. And I think it's very difficult for me as somebody who has the privilege not only to still be working and to have the technology that allows me to communicate with you in this way, and the privilege that I'm really recognizing now is the ability to get out and walk around the national forest out back here behind my house. Excuse me. So many levels of privilege. I guess it was Bruce Seifert who explained to me early on when I was first creating the Masters of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities that if the solutions that you offer don't allow everybody to get on board and see how that vision benefits them as well, it's pretty hard to really develop a sustainable community, because that segment of the population that does not feel carried along by those processes will not be buying in, and you'll have a different sort of set of challenges to deal with, just getting people on board. Some of the most attractive solutions to me, thinking about how we come out of this and redefine our sense of normal, are solutions that make sense for people with enormous privilege. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out when we think about the people who do not have employment to begin with, food security, access to technology, that sort of thing. You know, there are some people who would probably love to have the time that Lucas, coming back to Steve's comment, that Lucas has to spend with his family now at dinner, and that I do too, where that's just not a very realistic scenario. So when we think about the structural reforms at the economy or the governmental level required to I guess share the wealth in a way, or redistribute at least some level of security to allow people to enjoy the benefits that we do, we're talking about a real radical overhaul. And I guess in the past, I'm thinking FDR days, when we've seen a radical overhaul of federal systems, it has been in response to crisis. We do have one time scale of crisis going on right now with COVID. We've got another crisis going on with climate change, but I haven't really seen the political will emerge that would allow us to convert that into structural change. I'll just put that out there and see how folks would respond.
Yeah, Laird, if I could jump in, I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think all of us have addressed privilege and just the inequality that the COVID pandemic has brought up. But I think it's really worth mentioning before we start talking about the solutions, just to have a quick description of how privilege is playing out currently in the COVID world, this environment that we're living in. And I have a restaurant in addition to doing my science consulting work here in New Orleans, and it's been a lot of fun. Just branching out into a new field. I focus a lot on food sustainability in the New Orleans area, and get to do a lot of educational work around conservation and food sustainability through that. But it's interesting now as a business owner, so I'm applying for the payroll protection plan loans that the Small Business Association is putting out through the Treasury Department and so forth. And these loans are just to give an example, these loans are meant for small businesses to help, to be the Band-Aid that Ken mentioned, to help keep people going, help keep businesses from collapsing. And we have, the Lakers got $4.6 million, and Ruth's Chris, which is a very large publicly traded restaurant chain, got $20 million. And I could go on and on. I'm not going to take our time listing that, but you see this trend where people who are wealthy, or companies that are wealthy, or companies that are publicly traded and have the means of raising income outside of the government bailout, taking advantage of what would have been, what was intended for a different audience. And I'm not saying that that's the only time that we're seeing this in this COVID. I'm just using that as an example to show how it's easy for the privileged to be the ones who come out on top yet again when there's a crisis like this. And I'm glad that you mentioned the FDR approach following the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, because that was the opposite. It was, it really was, as Kenneth said, getting people out, 100,000 people out corona testing, and then put them to work in other ways. It is that structural, those structural changes. But without those structural changes, a lot of even the assistance and what we think we're doing to help, and we're coming together in community, is going to the privileged.
I would add a piece to that too. Every day we get hit with the facts on number of deaths and new infections in various countries, and inserted into that every so often you'll get a study that looks at the broader impacts globally, but also in the US. And so one in particular was a prediction of 265 million person increase in hunger and malnutrition globally because of that. And when you take that number and you compare that to, the US currently has 1 million infections and deaths up around 100,000, certainly that's, tragic and highly concerning. But how quickly we rush to address again those immediate concerns, especially when they tend to broadly affect society, meaning across class. And yes, we'll deal with the other impacts later, but 265 million makes the other numbers really pretty small. And that's what concerns me when I have hopes for what might come out in an FDR style revolution out of this. I would love to think that it would include movements towards greater sustainability ecologically, but my real hope is that we'll finally wake up and say, we have a worthless healthcare system, at least from a global perspective. And here we are in this pandemic. How could we have gotten here with the healthcare system we have? Let's fix that. We're struggling educationally. We're seeing huge divides between those kids. So I teach for a small, half private, half public school. My students are doing great educationally. We're really able to. They all have technology they took home. We're all able to put together online lesson plans. Okay, great, might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I'm not worried they're going to be facing an educational gap going into next year because they lost a quarter of their school this year. And that's nowhere near true for most of our students who are in lower income school systems. And I see it with my younger kids who are going to our local public school, where half the kids can't participate because they don't have the technology. Of the half that are there, another half can't really participate because they have parents who are essential workers and are out having to work. So here they are in elementary school and they're supposed to be doing online class, and they just don't have the support they need at home to make that happen. So I'm hoping, personally, that's another area we see a knock on, is to say, we need to shore up our educational systems, and if that means more technology and online, I'm good with that. But none of those are going to change the overall production consumption patterns of our society and make us more ecologically sustainable.
And I would, I think it's unfortunate, but government action that we're seeing in terms of the Federal Reserve and all the stimulus money, the payroll protection, it's actually further exacerbating, I think, in the end, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. It really is unprecedented in terms of the amount of debt that our government is assuming. And, in some, like as Kenneth is mentioning, some sort of FDR type program, that was just talking about the Green New Deal just a few months ago, and that seems to have been kind of off the news. I mean, instead of putting all this money into hedge funds and shoring up banks, we could be using those resources that the Federal Reserve is putting into the economy in a way that I think could be much more effective, and it actually begin to shrink that divide between the wealthy and the privileged, the wealthy and the economically challenged segments of our society.
Yeah, thank you. Thinking about the healthcare system as well as federal programs, federal stimulus, takes me back to that question of what might a new empowering normal look like. And referring back again to the article that I've referred to a few times, Webster says normal may not be possible or advisable anymore. Instead, communications that focus on preparedness as well as support resonate with people across the political spectrum, building a new idea of what is normal. And so if the new normal doesn't necessarily say everybody's got to stay at home, everybody has to use this much less energy, go shopping that much less, but instead says that we create systems of preparedness, whether those are health systems. We've got Amanda here from New Orleans, and I think that probably those of us who saw the footage, much less lived through it, will never forget Katrina and how that exposed ways that we were not prepared. Jen, I can only imagine that with hurricanes in North Carolina, there are levels of lack of preparedness in terms of infrastructure. So theoretically, if a new normal means building in an attitude of preparedness and actually beyond the attitude, investment in being prepared, in a sense, it requires us to normalize the events that we see, whether they're severe weather events or pandemics or whatever, and say that we have been proven again and again to be inadequately prepared for, I'm going to say, life in the time of climate crisis, but I would not use that language in many conversations now, because there are political red flags associated even with a term like climate change. So I find myself, when I'm talking with local officials and that sort of thing, talking more and more about quality of life. How do we ensure a satisfying quality of life for people? And you can build in plans for climate resilience underneath that kind of heading. But anyhow, that's one way of thinking about a new normal in ways that may be appealing to everybody. How do we make sure that the next time our regular lives are disrupted, that we have in place the systems that are going to allow us to move through it with a minimum of discomfort? We do have at least one question from a viewer, and I do want to invite, I'll read this question, and whoever would like to take it, please do. But for the rest of you who are with us on this call, feel free to put in your questions, whether through the chat or unmute yourself. But this first question that we received came from Eileen, who says, referencing Jen's comment, I love that physical distance, social solidarity. It conveys a different mindset. And then this question for any of the panelists. I keep thinking that since we went through the pains of a semi-shutdown and demonstrated we can survive this, what if states implemented a once-a-month weekend shutdown to help regenerate families and communities? So I'll put that out there to whoever would like to respond.
I can jump in briefly. I think that this kind of question is a great question, and one that I want to be asking my community, and I hope we should be asking that kind of all the way up the chain, is what is it that we are getting from this that we want to be able to repeat? And it might not be that specific thing, but that kind of thing. Sorry, my dishwasher is beeping at me, but someone's coming to open it. Is exactly where we can be expanding just our way of thinking about the world in this moment.
I think it's a great idea myself. So here's where I put my economist hat on, though, is, so, okay, one weekend a month, everybody, does the quarantine thing, has their meals with their families, doesn't drive, stays home. I mean, that's my lifestyle. But I remember very clearly my father-in-law, who was the dean of a business school and pretty successful business person, telling us, I'm glad your lifestyle works for you, but heaven help the economy if other people start living like that. And and the lesson was accurate. So if you take one weekend a month, what is that, about 3 to 5% of consumption you take off the table, which, if managed well, is a great thing. It's the direction we need to head. And if not managed well, it means a section of the economy being underemployed, unemployed. And I don't know how to put those two things together to get society to say, it is a good thing to reduce consumption, and let's find ways to not make it painful. And I'll just throw out, there's one other related current in society right now, which is the recognition that a lot of jobs are being lost to automation. And so a lot of you have probably heard of the idea of, a universal minimum income, and saying, well, society is becoming more disruptive for people in jobs that are being taken over by automation. Maybe one way we can address that is creating a safety net, a universal minimum income. And maybe this is an opportunity to push that a little more, because that would provide some of that underlying security Laird's mentioning.
Thanks, Kenneth. Thinking beyond, I guess this is really an economic question, but I invite anybody to answer it. Some of you have probably had the experience in the last week of seeing the new documentary, Planet of the Humans, which has really, for me, exposed a rift. And perhaps we can connect this to Naomi Klein's recent work, where for a significant section of environmental or sustainability related activists, capitalism is seen not as just contributing to our dysfunction, but as the very cause of our lack of sustainability. And if you haven't seen the film, what it does is it takes on the green energy section of the economy and points out the inefficiencies, which I think certainly Steve has been working with questions like intermittency for years. It's not like people working in the field are unaware of inefficiencies, but when you're looking at total carbon outputs, how do we begin to mitigate our damage in terms of climate change? But the point I'm getting at here is, as I think about the schism that is exposed by this film, there seems to be a level of indignation on the part of the filmmakers that big business would even get involved in green energy. And the fact that people are seeing a way to profit from alternative energy sources, when at the same time, theorists like Klein have identified capitalism as the real cause of the problem. How do you use the problem to solve the problem? That's part of what I see emerging out of this. So within a capitalist global economy within a often dysfunctional representative democracy. These are the tools that we have at our disposal right now. Is it possible to use such imperfect tools to affect the changes that we need to create a more sustainable human experience of the planet? I'll put that out to all of you.
Well, that's a big one, Laird. That's, I guess maybe, I think, Kenneth and others recognize that, our consumption-based society really is at the core of a lot of our environmental and climate crises. And Tim Jackson wrote a book about the end of growth, or I forget the name of it. It was a report he did for the UK, and he said, growth is not sustainable, but the alternative is really destabilizing. So how do we provide gainful employment for people where they feel they're doing good work, being valued, being compensated for that, but at the same time, develop our production and consumption systems that exist within the boundaries of what nature can sustain, the ecological economist kind of viewpoint. And so I guess, is there anything that we can learn from this experience over the past 6 weeks that gives us new insights in terms of a path to a different economic system of production and consumption? And I don't know that the answer to this. I have not seen the movie Laird about the critique of green energy, and I would imagine there's some important points that are made in that, and I've covered some of that in some of the courses that I've taught. So I guess kind of put that question out: is there something that we can learn from this 6-8 week experience that offers some new insights in terms of path towards this more sustainable economy? And one, that we started this whole conversation with this fact that the government in this crisis has taken decisive action and has controlled our economy. You can't open, you're not an essential service. So that is an insight that if we appreciate the challenge and the solution, that the government can play a role in directing an economy that may work for more people and work for the environment as well.
Thank you, Steve. We've got 2 other questions that have come in from folks attending. One of them is related, so I'll start with that. This is from Stephanie, who says that local responses in my rural area have included significant resources toward mutual aid, something that I've been really excited to see as well. Is it realistic to think that this model is scalable or sustainable long-term to promote equity, while the systems that enforce that inequity and injustice are hopefully dismantled? So I'll put that out to you again. The model of mutual aid, is it realistic to think that the work that communities have taken on among themselves to provide for people in need, is it realistic to think that that is scalable or sustainable to promote equity while the systems that promote inequity are being dismantled?
Yeah, I think that's the question that we're all asking ourselves in this. That I mean, I know I don't have an answer for that. I'd love to be able to say absolutely yes, there is a way. And I do believe, as a citizen, I believe that we can work, continue the mutual aid, and to Gabrielle's question as well, people looking out for one another. How do we keep this volunteerism going? I think it's going to be up to us as individual citizens. That's just my take, and I'd love to hear from Jenn and government and others too. But I feel like it's going to take more of a grassroots effort than a top-down government approach, at least in our current structures.
Yeah, I agree that that is kind of the question. So the hardcore anarchist in my community would say, hell yes, absolutely. But I'm a little more skeptical isn't even a word, because we are absolutely seeing mutual aid play a profound role in our community. And I hear about it, mutual aid groups popping up all over the place. And it's been a really powerful, like I saw in your question, Stephanie, tool in some rural communities that I think folks might not necessarily have predicted before. So that's really exciting. I think an example that I draw from about how scalable it is there was one of the hurricanes a couple years ago that really devastated the eastern part of our state. We had this amazing mutual aid response that was our local groups who teamed up with some pilots from Texas who had their own airplanes, who had started dropping direct aid after, was it Maria that devastated Houston? I lose track of the names. But so this was after Maria, and they had seen those pilots being able to drop their loads when government was too slow or unable to get to folks. And they recruited these pilots. The pilots worked in their network, and for 3 solid weeks, dropping food, loading airplanes, dropping food out to Eastern North Carolina when the state and federal government either couldn't get there because everything they had was just too big, big airplanes, big boats, whatever it was, or the federal government was just being too slow. I don't know where they were. And we found a hangar out at the airport, and that somebody let us use, and just people driving in all kinds of supplies. I mean, it was intense, and it was inspirational, and it was powerful. And I kept thinking, my God, all this effort, it shouldn't be this hard. And so that's where I think that the role of government really, ideally, government, so much of it is about harm reduction. And ideally, our government should be there to reduce harm quickly, at least faster than 3 weeks, because that's not sustainable. People can't just keep doing that. So I don't have a great answer either, but I definitely think that there's a really powerful role to that, that I still have a lot to learn from. I'm learning from it every day.
I will just add quickly, as we prepare to move on to the next question, that one of the models of mutual aid that is more sustainable, in other words, it doesn't emerge as a response to urgent situations, is something like the transition movement, transition towns across the US and across the UK, actually around the world now, where people have recognized the inability of federal institutions to provide the social support networks, to provide the economic incentives and securities for people within a capitalist system. So I'd encourage you to check out Transition USA or just transitionmovement.org, I believe, to look at what people are doing around the country, to have a identifiable community-based organization in your town, in your neighborhood, that is, by the very virtue of their existence, providing resources, tool lending libraries, information resources, events that bring people together, means that if those organizations are then there to step up in times of emergency, we don't have to do a lot of the work that we see our mutual aid volunteers creating from scratch every time. Whether it's being a part of the transition movement or creating other alternatives to that, how do we create these networks in our own communities that prepare us to help serve each other? I think Jim Dodge, one of my favorite writers, and if you've taken the bioregional approach to communities course, you recognize Jim Dodge, who says something to the effect of the easiest way to express your dissatisfaction with the larger government or economy is to withhold your participation in it, to get your needs met in different ways. Obviously, there are limits to that, but if we are creating systems or networks that do allow us to meet some of those needs in more immediate and personal and familiar ways than a federal institution sending us a check, I think that is a way to begin to wean ourselves from that. I do want to read another question that we have from Gabrielle, who says, as a lifetime volunteer, both for disaster relief and community assistance, this pandemic has created and shown the heart of the community engagement dynamic, where people are looking out for one another and not just themselves. My question, once the stay-at-home orders are lifted, how do we get citizens to keep up that volunteerism, and how can we utilize that to help create the new normal, both as a society and for the environment? So I'll put that out to you all. And I suspect that the fact that folks aren't necessarily jumping forward to answer all these questions reflects the extent to which we all feel like, well, that's not really my area of expertise. So many of the questions being raised right now are questions that occur outside our areas of expertise. But the general question, can we think of ways in which it's possible to keep up the volunteerism, I guess, to sustain the sense of more is being asked of me now, and I feel drawn, I feel compelled to act on my compassion, the connection I feel with other people. And actually, I guess I would ask a slightly different sort of question. Is it even possible to sustain that over the long term, or is that really an emergency response sort of behavior?
So I realize we're probably supposed to be a little bit nonpartisan, but the first thing we need to do if we want to sustain any kind of positive movement is change who's in the White House and change the tone that's being set from the top down. Because, you know, I see it here in my community, this should be a time of coming together, and there's enough individuals out there who don't really believe this is an emergency, don't believe what they hear in the media, and you just have this core of schism in our society that's being led daily. And I'm really skeptical of any long-standing change at a community level of bringing people together until we somehow figure out ways to to not be at each other's throats in that way. The other quick thing I would just add is I feel when it comes to addressing issues of need, there's definitely a lot of benefit from bringing people together, neighbor to neighbor, and so on, and in certain situations. But I also feel a little bit like I'm comparing backyard gardens to, you know, larger scale organic farms. And if you want mutual aid, there are models out there in the world that work really well. So just for example, suppose as a society we said, gee, wouldn't it be great if when our neighbor, you know, they had a child, not only could, you know, one parent take a few weeks off of unpaid maternity leave, but what if, you know, one of them got 3 months off and the other got 6 months off of paid maternity leave, and we came together as a community, and anytime somebody had a child, we said, we're going to make this happen, we'll pitch in the money and make it happen. Well, this happens in a lot of European countries, and it happens through taxation and a benefit provided from the federal government. And, you know, I mean, it is very possible and efficient to meet these needs. A single payer healthcare system would go incredible ways towards meeting people's regular needs. But, you know, and it's not to discount setting up other mechanisms for getting people to work together and look after each other. Those are equally important too. But on the kind of scale we need, you know, that's what I believe in pushing for.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just chime in a little bit here. So I live in a very small rural community in central Vermont, and it really has been, you know, inspiring to see the community come together. There are, you know, every week there's some of the local people that are cooking and delivering food to people in need. It really has been inspirational. In the prospect of that continuing post-COVID, you know, I guess maybe I'm probably skeptical as Kenneth is that will continue. But one thing that I've noticed is there seems to be new networks are creating. We've got a very vibrant local food economy in our region. And so every week I go to a local farm, dairy farm, Larson Farm to get my milk for the week. And now they're carrying produce from some of the other farms in the area, and they've got maple syrup from another farmer, and, you know, pork from another farmer. So it's really, there's networks have come together, and they've been there kind of, you know, in the farmers market scene, but now there's kind of more organic networks are evolving, connecting products to communities, and it's just really been awesome, very convenient, and that's something I could see that might be sustained post COVID, where these new networks have emerged, and there's some real efficiency and benefit to those.
Yeah, and I'll just tack on to that a perspective just from a bigger city. You know, New Orleans isn't a huge city, but it's a lot bigger than small town Vermont. And you know, I didn't jump right in at first when the question was asked, because I agree with Kenneth that it's going to take some changes in government. But I also, just to go back to my question for the last, or to my response to the last question, that I think a lot of this is going to be happening at the grassroots level, and those systems that Steve was just talking about, those networks that are being built, those tend to be pretty resilient. And in New Orleans, for instance, after Hurricane Katrina, one of the, I mean, we all know about all the horror that happened, and the slow government response, and the inequality in aid and everything that happened with that. But one of the positives that came out of that crisis was that the community became a lot closer knit. And I actually was here for Katrina in New Orleans. I didn't evacuate, I stayed. And later evacuated because I was doing my master's at Tulane, and the university shut down for a semester, so I had to go elsewhere. But now, so then I was gone for 11 years and came back to the city, and I could see that a lot of the spirit of volunteerism and those networks to, you know, to have food sustainability, to work with the homeless, not to say that the problems have been solved here by any means, but the legacy of Katrina is still felt here in the city. And I think it normalized a lot of volunteerism and help. For instance, if somebody's in trouble, you know, somebody that might not even really know that person says, okay, I'm going to set up a GoFundMe site, or you know, the community just really pitches in. And even now we see social distancing jazz bands going down the streets playing jazz funerals for the people who have died that couldn't have a funeral. And it's the idea that we're all in this together, and that sense of community, even in a city of a couple million people.
Thank you so much. I did promise the panelists that we would try to wrap up by 2:30 Pacific, which we're coming up on in about 10 minutes. But Jenn has raised a question, and Jenn, maybe instead of just reading it, I'll just go ahead and ask you if you'd like to ask this question about austerity measures to the other panelists. I'll just, by way of context, keep in mind that after the World Trade Center attacks in 2001, the response to that was go out and shop. I don't know if you remember that. Go shopping. This is the best thing that you can do here. I do at least half expect to see something like that emerging, which is the absolute opposite of using austerity measures as a way of revising our behavior. So Jenn, let me just go ahead and pass it off to you to ask your question of the other panelists.
Yeah, so I think I agree that we're likely to see some kind of, go out and shop encouragement from the current federal administration. I fully anticipate that, and probably from governors, et cetera, too. I think many will find that hard to resist. But I also think that the lack of money coming into state and local coffers is a real thing. I mean, it's going to be pretty profound. I know that for our town, we're basically like, we're just not spending any money except on things we absolutely have to right now until we wait and kind of see what is going to unfold in the next couple of months. But I guess what my question is, especially in thinking about the work that the other panelists do, is I've had this conversation briefly with some of my colleagues, friends that I have, self-labeled progressives in other jurisdictions, where we know that language of austerity is going to come in when really we need to be spending money to, whether it's with, in an ideal world, it would be things like Kenneth has brought up about, hiring people, getting a Green New Deal, putting all that kind of stuff into action. But I think that there's going to be a big push to cut because, because the economy has taken such a big hit. And so anyway, the conversation is, how do we avoid not just the language, but really articulate, we still need to be spending money on, both adaptation and mitigation with the climate crisis, among other things. So that's my question.
We we do a lot of work with municipalities, state governments, and absolutely this is affecting their revenue. The tax revenue is not coming in, and in this project in Maine we're working on, they're talking about submitting to the legislature next year a climate action plan. And that climate action plan now is, within the light of diminishing state revenues. And so they're already having conversations about the trade-offs between, the work that they know is critical. They're, have a legislative mandate to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. But now they're faced with, very limited state budgets to begin to implement that. So I think that's going to be a real challenge. There's going to be some important thinking about how do we continue the important work to address climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, in an era of at least short-term diminished state and local budgets.
And I would add federal. I mean, federal revenues are going to be down. I'm still a little bit in shock at how quickly we spent $2.5 trillion. Just boom. And so, the deficit hawks have allowed that to pass for now, but there's going to be a ton of pressure, I think, to cut federal spending as well. And it's never done in any way that makes a lot of sense, where you could save billions in military spending relatively easily. They're going to try and get it out of food stamps and educational spending in the arts. So yeah, I think the threat's very real. I've never understood how we continue to manage to frame our national economic discussion as one of constant scarcity. You know, we've doubled production, you know, approximately every 30 years, and somehow we still seem always poor and can't afford things like educational spending.
Yeah, it's a matter of priorities.
I offer this not out of any knowledge or even an accurate sense of the complexity of the situation, but relating your question, Jen, to earlier question about how to sustain this sense of volunteerism, mutual aid. I wonder if there are innovative ways, I'll go ahead and use the term entrepreneurial ways, for municipalities to be able to invite people to support them. And I don't mean just like the really silly example, you know, bake sales to support libraries and that sort of thing. But if people were being encouraged to go out and spend, and there were clearly defined opportunities where that spending would also benefit local county agencies, that sort of thing, even if it's just you know, a percentage of sales going to support or matching funds or something like that. I do think it's possible to harness the desire that we all feel to help. And it's going to be really hard for us not to feel like, okay, that part's done once we're allowed to go back out and shop like normal and that sort of thing. So I guess we need to figure out how to tell a story, or thousands of different stories based on thousands of different communities about, you know, I'm glad we made it through it as well as we did. You know, express whatever sort of emotions are appropriate to what each individual community has gone through, and then to make that case of we will continue to feel the economic hit of this moving forward, and we won't have access to services that we're used to unless we find ways to do that. And I don't see anybody, you know, cutting a check as a contribution to a city government or something like that. But if there are ways to tie that into spending that happens, again, designated spending that's going to help support municipalities, I am hopeful that people will imagine versions of this that I can't even begin to. I do want to keep track of the time. We're coming up to the very end here. So if anybody has any last things that they would like to say, we do have a few minutes for that.
If I can say real quick, I'm calling from Richmond, Virginia, and I so appreciate everybody's, all the panelists, themes and subjects, and I do wanted to the theme of what Jen was talking about. I think one thing that it's missing, and I see it here, and actually it kind of wraps up with what you mentioned about the documentary that Michael Moore came out about the Planet of the Humans. It's conservation. In conservation, we just don't talk about it. You know, it might be in names and titles, but we really don't. And it's been what I keep saying in my groups is like, this documentary has talked about the elephant in the room, because whenever for years, I'm a long time advocate, environmental advocate, community activist, and conservation is the last thing that is spoken of. I am proud of the community I live in, which is a smaller rural community, and we try to push for local, to do local and support local. But conservation is the one thing that seems to be missing out, like true, and you know, just not the consumerist if you're going to consume, then have it be local. But I do appreciate that Jenn brought that up, because it is worrisome to think about what's going to happen if we don't start thinking about a more conservative mindset, and meaning resources, conservation, and not making people feel like you're lacking, but this is a choice.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, everyone. This is great.
Thank you. I do see a message from Carla, who's helping moderate here, that if you would like to receive a transcript or copy of this, shoot her an email through the chats. That's the best way to do that. I do want to say very quickly that these kinds of conversations that we're having here, and as a part of this series of community resilience conversations, are a natural part of the kinds of thinking and sharing that we're doing in creating and maintaining the Masters of Science program in Resilient and Sustainable Communities, which is here at Prescott now. It's been up and running for about 5 years, earlier at Green Mountain College. If you know of anybody who might be interested in doing this kind of work, we're trying to be responsive in developing and revising our curriculum. So our courses in emergency management and communication and community health are right now being revised to have a keener sense of what it means to live through a pandemic. But it's a program that I think really does provide people the background that would help them be really powerful in a variety of positions and making a difference. So I'll just mention, I know Liam would be upset with me if I didn't, that we are having an informational session tomorrow, Thursday at noon Pacific time. So if you know of anybody who might be interested in a Masters of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities, please let them know that. And otherwise, Carla, I don't know if you have anything else to say, but I think we're about ready to wrap up. You good? Okay. Well, thank you so much to everybody for being a part of this. I really treasure the opportunity to hear from people who I respect and who have experiences different than my own, who give me a more nuanced, hopefully, understanding of what we're going through together. So I wish you all the best. Stay well, take care of each other, and we'll have another one of these next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.